Thank you, everybody, for joining. Welcome to the 2025 West Yorkshire Pension Fund Employers Meeting. First of all, I need to give some apologies. So, the chair of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund Advisory Panel, Councillor Andrew Thornton, would normally provide this introduction, would normally join us and was planning to, but unfortunately he's been having some IT difficulties this morning. So we thought it might be better, it didn't take the risk of things going wrong. He was going to join remotely. So I'm going to fill in and provide the introduction. I will be introducing myself, which is a little bit strange. I'll be taking the first section of the meeting, talking through a few of the big things that have happened over the year and looking forward to what might happen in the remainder of this year and going forwards. I suspect many people will be interested in the actuarial valuation, which is obviously going on at the moment. So we're joined by Sam Ogborn and Joel Duckham from Aon, who are the West Yorkshire Pension Fund Actuary. And sat next to me here in Bradford is John Dewey, who is the relatively new West Yorkshire Pension Fund Chief Investment Officer. So John's going to talk through some of the key investment issues. A bit of an investment focus, I would say, with John here, but clearly administration plays a huge role in West Yorkshire Pension Fund, and I'd like to thank all employers for their role in helping the administration of the fund run smoothly. We do rely on accurate and timely data submissions from employers to ensure all goes smoothly. As many people joining will be aware, it's not just West Yorkshire Pension Fund members we provide the administration for. We also administer 3 other LGPS funds and 24 fire authorities. So overall, it's about 500,000 members that have their pension administered from the team here. Excellent. I hope everybody's joined. I will run through. We're probably going to last about, it's scheduled for an hour and a half, this meeting, but we're hoping that there will be time at the end for some questions. We decided not to take questions as we go along, as we think many of the questions will hopefully be answered during the course of the presentations. But we'll try and allow some time at the end to ask questions either of Aon or John or myself. Okay. First of all, some facts and figures. The assets of West Yorkshire Pension Fund stood at a fraction under 20 billion at the year end at 31st of March. This is a high year-end asset figure for the fund. The number of employers in the fund, and this is employers that are actively contributing, stood at 425 at the year end. Number of members, 327,000. Also an increase on the year before. An average pension in payment figures, so £5,300 for pensioner members and roughly £3,500 for dependent members. Relatively chunky increase on the year before. There was a 6.7% pension increase that went through at the start of the 2024 financial year, which has increased that average pension. But I think you will all agree that these are far from gold-plated pension figures that you might hear bandied around the press occasionally. In many cases, it keeps members out of the social security net and provides them with some financial security in their retirement. And the final figure we've got here is the number of team members within West Yorkshire Pension Funds. We're up to about 217 at the year end. All of these figures were an increase of between about 2% and 6% on the year before, so a gradual increase in the size of the fund in several respects. So this slide highlights some of the key issues that we have faced or are continuing to face, both on a national basis and locally. I mentioned pensions administration in my introduction. This is always a challenge. There is never a time where pension administration teams think, this isn't too bad. It's always a continual challenge, as long as I've been involved in the pensions industry. A couple of big projects we refer to there that do impact the LGPS in particular, and many public sector schemes. So one is McCloud. You'll have probably heard reference to the McCloud remedy. This was put in place to rectify the changes to the scheme made in 2014, which were deemed to be age discriminatory. So all members who were in service at 2014 now have some some form of protection, which is this McLeod remedy. It's in progress. We're not quite finished the process yet, but I think we know what to do and how to go about it now. So there's a lot more clarity in the McLeod remedy than there was. I think the fire pension scheme, their equivalent of McLeod, is probably more troublesome than the LGPS equivalent at the moment. And the other thing we mentioned here is pensions dashboards. I've also made really good progress on the pensions dashboards. Connection date for all public service schemes was 31st of October. This is to connect with the dashboard infrastructure, so effectively give the dashboards access to our member data. We've done what we need to do. The connection now is between what's known as our integrated service provider and the pensions dashboard programme. So we've fulfilled our side of the bargain in being dashboard ready. The dashboards themselves, we don't know exactly when they're going to come online. Could yet be a year or so away. I think government said that there'll be 6 months notice given before the go live date. We're sort of thinking what impact it might have on our administration service. I think there could be quite a lot of activity on our member helpline, for example, when the dashboards go live. This might well be a good thing, although it might cause some headaches in the short term. I think increased engagement and awareness of pensions for members can only be a good thing. And I think I'm becoming more and more positive about the dashboards programme in general, the more I think about it. And I have come across people, not members of the LGPS, who have said that it'd be really good to know where all our pensions are. And I think there could be a boost to UK economic growth as well from the pensions dashboard if everything goes to plan. So that's one I look forward to with interest. I mentioned earlier the 2025 valuation process. I won't go into great detail here because I have a slide later on and you'll be hearing at length from the actuary. That's obviously a big deal at the moment. We've got the UK economy and public sector finances. Again, this will be a theme that I will have commented on many times before. UK economic growth is clearly not as high as we would like it to be and the government would like it to be. Productivity in particular has been relatively sluggish in the EU, as it has in the UK and many parts of the developed world. And public sector finances are obviously challenging. I don't need to tell people on this call that. Local government, in particular, the ageing population, social care pressures is a particular challenge. The combination of those two things is obviously a key function for local government and the LGPS. And the final thing I mention here is the changing ESG landscape. I presented at this meeting a year ago, probably a week or two before the American election. I think it was the 7th of November. Didn't know how the American election was going to turn out. I think it's fairly obvious there's been a little bit of sort of rollback on ESG, certainly in America, and it's difficult for the rest of the world to ignore what's going on in America, of course, because they dominate world financial markets to such an extent. So it's been an interesting time in terms of ESG and responsible investment in general over the last year, and there's obviously global conflicts going on as well, which has a clear impact in this area. So interesting time for that. More specifically for West Yorkshire Pension Fund, we changed our governance arrangements. So we used to have two advisory panels. So there was an investment advisory panel that used to meet on a quarterly basis. As the name suggests, it focused on investment matters. And then we had a joint advisory group, which used to meet on a 6-monthly basis, which dealt with the administration, governance, financial matters. We've combined those two groups. We now have a West Yorkshire Pension Fund advisory panel, which meets on a quarterly basis. So the thinking behind that, and I think it's worked well to date with the 2 meetings of this group, is it's more integration between investment and administration and governance, so a bit more of a joined up approach. And things like the actuarial valuation is a good example of where this is required. You can't just tackle the investment aspects of that in isolation. It needs to be joined up. Another positive, we may have been slightly fortunate here in timing. You may have heard reference to the Good Governance Project run by the MHCLG. It's been rumbling on for many years, and there was a kind of frustration, where's this going? When's it going to see the light of day? And then when government announced changes to pooling, they also put some changes to LGPS governance in there as well. So this Good Governance Project did finally see the light of day. We're expecting any day now, could be in the next week or two, some LGPS specific regulations for consultation. It will change. It will comment on pooling, and it will also comment on governance changes that government wish to see in LGPS funds. I think we have a reasonable idea of what is going to be in there. And I think our changes that we've made to our governance arrangements at West Yorkshire should go a long way to satisfying what government requires. It's linked in closely to pooling, which is mentioned in the bullet point below. The general concept is that government wants LGPS funds to be making less granular decision making. It wants the pool to be making the more granular decision making. So its high level strategic asset allocation will be set by the LGPS funds, and then the detailed investment decision making will be done by the pool. Quick recap in case people don't know what I mean by referring to the pool. So for about 10 years now, West Yorkshire Pension Fund has worked very closely with Greater Manchester Pension Fund and Merseyside Pension Fund, effectively collaborating in how we manage our investments. So this is the Northern LGPS pool. Our model is slightly different to some of the other pools in other parts of the country, which I shall go on to explain. And the final point I mention on this slide is around our new website. I think I announced at this meeting last year that we had recently created a new website. I think it's been very positive, the impact of it, but work is never done in these areas. So some extra functionality we are expecting to come online very shortly. There will be a member portal up and running where it will allow members to run off pensions estimates, which will be good for members and good for our administration in general. So we're constantly evolving the website, trying to improve its functionality. Okay, quick few comments on financial reporting changes in local government. Probably slightly less of a big issue than this was a year ago and maybe 2 years ago. I did report previously that there was delays in local authorities finalising accounts. I think they have improved. I think it's probably still slightly slower than everybody would like, but definite improvement in local authorities finalising accounts. Generally, the backlog has gone in most authorities. I think there will be still a small number of authorities out there that won't have finalised previous year's accounts, but Bradford is more or less back on track. Hasn't quite finalised its 24-25 accounts yet, but I think that will be done soon. As a result, West Yorkshire Pension Fund can't formally finalise its accounts because our accounts are part of Bradford, go into the Bradford accounts. But we have done our annual report that is available on draft on the website, and our audit is largely complete. So we've got a clean bill of health there. You will note the second bullet point at the top, separation of LGPS fund accounts from those of the administering authority. So we think this current year we're in, 25-26 financial year, will be the last year where we need to consolidate the West Yorkshire Pension Fund accounts within the Bradford accounts. Some of the details are still to be finalised. I assume that we'll have the same auditor as Bradford Council going forward. It's not entirely clear who's going to be signing the accounts. Will it be the Bradford Council Finance Director, or will it be someone involved in West Yorkshire Pension Fund? Some of the details are still to be ironed out, but we think 25-26 will be the last year of consolidation of accounts, and 26-27 will be the first year where West Yorkshire Pension Fund produces its own accounts, and our timelines aren't influenced by the timelines of Bradford Council, which I think is a positive thing. I think Scotland has already made this change. The final point down at the bottom is accounting guidelines. There was new accounting guidance introduced for LGPS funds for the previous year, but it was done on a best endeavours basis. You are required in 24-25 to report in accordance with these deadlines. So we have done this, and there'll be a slight change to our disclosures and how they look for 24-25. Quickly touch on membership trends. We've got a chart of active members, 2006 figures, and then last year in orange and 2025 in grey. Active members on the left, deferred members in the middle, pensioner members on the right. Deferred members are members who are no longer in active service, are no longer paying in, but haven't started to draw their benefits yet. Generally, deferred members have been increasing in previous years. They seem broadly stable this year. I think that's to do with something we're doing behind the scenes. We've created some automation to link records together. There'll be several lots and lots of members who will have more than one record with us. And in some cases, we can link it to make the administration simpler, both for the member and for ourselves. So that will probably keep the deferred member numbers down. Active membership numbers broadly stable, but you'll see quite a sharp increase in the pensioner number. So that's gone up by a few thousand. I think most LGPS funds will probably see pensioner numbers higher than active numbers these days. They were broadly similar for a while, but I think that the trend has been for more pensioners than actives. So I don't think there's anything terribly surprising in the West Yorkshire figures there. In terms of numbers of employers, I mentioned earlier 425. So we had 447 employers that contributed during the course of the year. 22 of those ceased contributing. Generally, contractors who have a contract with councils or schools or other statutory bodies having that contract coming to an end. We break down the numbers between two groups of employers, what we call scheduled bodies. They're employers that by law have to admit there are members to the fund. So councils, academy trusts, further education colleges are good examples. And then the other group of employers are admission bodies, some charities and housing associations, some universities, but mostly contractors, so employers that are undertaking a contract for one of the scheduled bodies. So this chart sets out inflation figures. John will probably go on to talk a bit more about this in his section and what it means from an investment context. I'm going to talk about it in the context of what it means for member benefits. We had a spike of very high inflation following the COVID pandemic. It's the September figure that we tend to look at from an administration perspective, the September CPI figure. 1 year it was 10.1%, then it was 6.7%. Last year it was quite low. It was actually down to 1.7% in September 2024. That meant that the pension increase applied in the LGPS, both the deferred benefits and the career average benefits built up by active members, as well as the pension in payment, was 1.7% in April 2025, which was the lowest we'd seen for a while. And then a couple of weeks ago, we got the September 25 CPI figure announced, which was 3.8%. So it's not a formality that is the pension increase for next April, but it will be in all likelihood. It is government that needs to make a decision on this. We expect the pension increase to those different types of pension that I described to be 3.8% in April next year. Slightly higher than we're predicting in the actuarial valuation. Sam and Joel from Aon will talk about this in their section. And also worth noting that the state pension will actually go up by more than this amount because of the impact of the triple lock. So the triple lock is the members, the state pensioners get the higher of inflation, earnings growth and 2.5%. And I think earnings growth is 4.7%. So that's likely to be the state pension increase in April 2026. A lot of numbers here, but this is setting out the sort of key points of our accounts. Key point to note, I would say, is that net additions line, so sort of 4 lines from the top. The figure is negative 194 million. So that's the difference between the contributions we receive, both from members and from employers, and the benefits that we pay out to members. So we received 674 million of contributions in total over the financial year, and we paid out 850 million pounds of benefits. I mentioned earlier, 6.7% pension increased that figure quite significantly from the year before, and we got more retirements as well as that pensioner number increased. No reason to panic though, because we have quite good investment income. So you'll see the line 6 rows down, or sorry, it might be 5 rows down, of 579 million of investment and other income. So that's things like dividends from shares, coupons from bonds, rentals from property. The way West Yorkshire Pension Fund's investments are structured, it tends to be cash in our bank account, which is good as well. So that is positive. So that covers that gap, that shortfall we're seeing from contributions being below benefits. But that shortfall is going to get bigger, I think, as Aon will explain. Contributions will come down, not in 25-26 financial year, or not materially anyway, but probably from 26-27 onwards once the valuation is complete. The good thing about having a positive cash flow once you've taken investment income into account is you shouldn't be a forced seller of assets. To the best of my knowledge, West Yorkshire Pension Fund has never been in the position where it's needed to sell something in order to pay the pensions, and that's a very good position to be in. When markets are doing well, it's not such a problem, but in times of financial distress, you don't want to be a forced seller, and it's something we're very keen to avoid. Other point I might draw out, we'll probably pass that £1 billion mark for benefits paid in the not too distant future. I think Greater Manchester Pension Fund has already got there, but we're probably not too far away at West Yorkshire either. Probably 2 or 3 years' time, realistically, before we're paying out more than £1 billion a year, which is a good thing, I suppose, and something we should be very proud of. Quick slide touching on costs. Costs in local government, for accounting purposes, we need to split them into 3 categories. We've got investment management costs, we've got administration costs, and we've got oversight and governance costs. And we tend to class them as per member. So for West Yorkshire, we'll be dividing the total cost by 327,000. Equates on investment costs to £22 a head, admin costs £18 a head, and oversight and governance costs. This is things like running board meetings and committee meetings. Those sorts of central overheads is £4.50 per member. Extremely low, both in the context of the LGPS and I think both in the context of running pension schemes in the UK in general. LGPS does sometimes get criticised for high costs. There may be some truth in that, but I think if you compare it against most other pension schemes, both in the UK and internationally, it does compare very, very favourably. We do benchmarking surveys, both on performance and on cost against global comparators, and we do perform favourably on those metrics. Overall, we believe West Yorkshire Pension Fund is the lowest cost LGPS fund. Cost isn't the be all and end all. Good performance is more important than cost. But cost is extremely important because over time it does mount up. These relatively small differentials in cost do compound. So very proud of that achievement across the board, really. I think all different types of costs we perform well on relative to our peers. I've got one more slide before I hand over to Aon. So this is around the 2025 actuarial valuation. It assesses the financial health of the fund. It sets employer contribution rates for the 3 years from the 1st of April 2026. I'm going to let Aon talk about the numbers. I'm going to focus mainly on the process here. We need to produce, and all LGPS funds need to produce, a document called the Funding Strategy Statement. So this sets out how you set the contribution rates, and it also is a bit wider than that. It sets out what happens when employers join the fund and when employers leave the fund. It also describes how we address some of the financial risks that we face. It's typical for LGPS funds to update this funding strategy statement each time they do an actuarial valuation. And there was some guidance provided by the LGPS Scheme Advisory Board before we started this valuation process, which was helpful. And we have done quite a thorough refresh of the funding strategy statement this time round. It was considered the initial draft of the funding strategy statement at the July meeting of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund Advisory Panel. The advisory panel at that meeting were happy that draft could go out for consultation with employers. So that consultation was launched in August and it closed in early October. We've got a phenomenal number of responses to the consultation. We've got over 150 responses, which I'm pretty sure is a record in the local government pension scheme. So good to see we have such engaged employers. It was a bit of a watershed for many reasons. I'm a bit of a Luddite, but I was sold on the benefits of artificial intelligence because the AI summary of these consultation responses I thought was remarkably good. I did read through them all and I thought it was an excellent summary that we produced. We used a few different AI tools and they all came back with very similar things as well, which was reassuring, I think. So we considered these responses. We actually formed a little subgroup of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund Advisory Panel that considered these FSS consultation responses. It helped draft the paper that we then took to the 23rd of October meeting of the panel, and there were some changes to the funding strategy statement recommended following this subgroup and the consideration of the responses. Aon will go through the details of what those changes are. I'll touch on the sort of feedback to employers. I think this is very important. Clearly, we've got today's meeting. I hope lots of employers have joined this meeting, and we'll have lots of questions for Aon, I'm sure, on their section that they're going to present. We're also going to produce, we have started doing this, we're going to produce a frequently asked questions document. There was lots of questions asked in these consultation responses that we received. We'll cover all of these questions. Any other questions that come in the valuation process, we'll keep it updated right the way through the process. So we will put that on the website and notify employers when that is available. We're happy to meet with employers individually if they have questions, particularly, if they have specific circumstances, very happy to meet and try and discuss those. And then we need to sort of finalise the valuation outcomes. So the funding strategy statement we will need to finalise by 31st of March. We will need to produce a document called a rates and adjustment certificate. So that sets out what contributions each of the employers is going to pay for the 3 years starting 1st of April 2026. And then we need to produce the formal valuation report as well. So we will have that ready. We've got a panel meeting in the middle of March, so I think we'll try and have all those documents approved at that panel meeting. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Aon, who hopefully have got some slides that they can share. So over to Sam and Joel.
Brilliant, thank you, Euan. Right, so I'm going to click share now, and hopefully it pops up. If someone could just confirm that they can see that, that'd be great. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Sam, yeah. Perfect. Right, yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. As Euan said, I'm Sam Ogborn, an actuary to the fund, and I'm joined by Joel, who's another senior actuary at Aon, who works alongside me advising West Yorkshire Pension Fund. So we've got a few things to talk through today, largely around the 2025 valuation, as Euan mentioned. So I'm going to start with a bit of background in terms of what the valuation is and what assumptions we have to make. And then I'll give you a high-level look at the results of the valuation at the whole of fund level. Joel's then going to talk through what those results generally mean for individual employers in section 3, before finishing with an update of what's happened since the valuation date and some other hot topics. So if we kick off then with section 1, valuation process and assumptions. And I'll start with what is an actuarial valuation. I think Euan summarised this quite well just a moment ago, and I'm probably repeating exactly what Euan said, but essentially it is two things. It's an assessment of the financial health of the pension fund, and it's the setting of contributions payable by pension fund employers to cover the costs of promised benefits. So what we're doing then when we do a valuation is we're comparing the assets held by the pension fund with the past service liabilities. So those past service liabilities are calculated by us as the fund's actuaries based on membership data in respect of the fund at the valuation date. So we collect that from the pension fund, all 327,000 records that Euan mentioned, and then we make some assumptions about what's going to happen in the future. Where the assets held are higher than the liabilities that we calculate, there's a surplus in the pension fund. And where the assets are lower than liabilities calculated, there's what's called a shortfall or deficit in the pension fund. We also work out a funding level or funding ratio, which is the assets divided by the liabilities. And our target position where we're trying to get to is a position where the assets equal the liabilities with no surplus or deficit, and the funding ratio is exactly 100%. So that sort of covers the benefits earned up to the valuation date. But whilst individuals are members of the fund, they're earning more pension benefits, and those benefits need to be paid for by employers. And those are called future service liabilities, and we work that figure out at the valuation date as a percentage of pensionable salary, and it's called the primary contribution rate. And I mentioned that we're trying to get to a position where there's no surplus or deficit and the funding ratio is 100%. So we get there by making an adjustment to the primary rate, and those are called secondary contributions. Where there's a deficit, the secondary contributions will be an additional contribution to be paid. And where there's a surplus, the secondary contributions will be a deduction against the primary contribution rate. And then, as Euan mentioned, we need to do an actuarial evaluation every 3 years. That's a regulatory requirement. And we get a full year to complete the valuation and produce a valuation report and a rates and adjustment certificate. And those changes to the contributions come in from that date, so from 1st of April 2026, and then those will apply for the next 3 years until the next actuarial valuation is completed. So I mentioned on that previous slide that we need to get some membership data and make some assumptions about what's going to happen in the future in order to calculate the liabilities. We can then work out what benefit cash flows we think are going to be required to be paid in the future, and that's what the chart on the right-hand side of this slide shows. So those bars represent expected cash flows for all members in the pension fund at the valuation date. And this isn't West Yorkshire specific, but it does show the typical lifetime of a sample LGPS pension fund. So over time then, we'd expect to see the amounts being paid to increase as the membership ages, more and more people's benefits come into payment and benefits increase in line with inflation. We then reach a peak, which looks to be around 25 years, 23 years maybe on that chart. And at that point, the amount of pension that is dying starts to overtake the amount of members that are retiring, and therefore the expected cash flows tail off into the future until the last member of the scheme dies somewhere around 80 years after we started. So when we're calculating liability value, what we're doing then is we're taking those cash flows, discounting them back into today's terms to determine how much money needs to be set aside now in order to meet all future expected West Yorkshire Pension Fund cash flows. Moving on to the assumptions that we make then, they're split into 2 categories. There's the financial assumptions and then demographic assumptions. The teal rectangles on the screen are the financial assumptions, and those are the assumptions that affect the size of the benefits in the LGPS. The financial assumptions are the level of inflation that affects pension increases and then also pay increases. And then along with the discount rate, which is the most significant assumption we make, and I'll cover that in a bit more detail later on. The grey rectangles on the slide then are what we call the demographic assumptions, and they affect the chance of a benefit payment being made. The most significant of those is the post-retirement mortality rate, because that affects how long benefits are going to be paid for. But as you can see on the slide, there are a number of other assumptions that we make. In terms of how we set these assumptions then, the demographic assumptions are set based on an experience analysis of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, which we carry out every 3 years just in advance of the valuation. Our CPI inflation assumption is set based on Aon's specialist views of what inflation will be in the long term. And then the salary increase assumption is set as an amount above CPI, so CPI plus something. And that's derived based on that experience analysis that I mentioned, plus the fund's views on future salary increases. And then a discount rate is derived using a risk-based approach, which I'm going to talk about again in a bit more detail in a couple of slides' time. Before that, though, this slide looks at, in a bit more detail, at what I said was the most significant of the demographic assumptions, the mortality assumption. So the mortality assumption can be split into 2 parts, a base table, which is a backwards-looking part, so i.e. what's happened in the past, and then future improvements, which is a forward-looking part, so i.e. how do we expect mortality rates to change in the future. So to determine the base table, we look at West Yorkshire Pension Fund experience data, and then we utilise Aon's longevity model called Demographic Horizons, which has a database of mortality information across the country by postcode. And just as an indicator, we've shown the West Yorkshire area in the chart on the right-hand side. So the different colours represent different areas and different mortality rates. The future improvements are set taking into account future improvement tables published by a body called the Continuous Mortality Investigation, which is a part of the actuarial profession. So they record information on mortality rates across the whole country, and they publish base tables and future improvement projections, which we can adjust based on Aon's mortality experts' views and the experience of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. So in terms of the impact on the liabilities of updating our assumptions, if we look at the table in the bottom left-hand corner, what we're seeing then is a reduction in expected lifetimes across all categories of member compared with our assumptions that we adopted at the 2022 valuation. Lower expected lifetimes mean that pensions are expected to be paid for less time, which results in a lower liability value being calculated. So So just to give an indication then, in the key takeaway at the bottom, you can see that the changes we've made in the mortality assumption, the 25 valuation, have resulted in roughly a 2% reduction in liabilities compared with the 2022 valuation assumptions. So moving on to the financial assumptions, and firstly, the discount rate. What I said earlier was the most important assumption that we make. So at Aon, when we calculate a discount rate, we operate what we call a risk-based approach. The discount rate is how we allow for prudence in our assumptions, which is something that we're required to do as actuaries. So what we do then is we start by looking at the assets that the fund will invest in over the long term. So for West Yorkshire Pension Fund, that's the table shown on the right-hand side of the slide. And then using information from our investment specialists, we can calculate a best estimate. And a best estimate means that we believe it has a 50% chance of being borne out in practice. So a best estimate future return on those assets over a given modelling period. But as I mentioned earlier, we need to allow for prudence. It's something we're required to do. And also as a fund, you don't want to be in a position where you only have a 50-50 chance of being able to pay benefits for members of the scheme. So what we do then is we look at different options that we call probabilities of funding success. The fund then decides on what probability of funding success to adopt for different groups of employers based on our guidance. So typically we would use a higher probability of funding success for employers that pose more risk to the fund. A higher probability of funding success leads to a lower discount rate and higher contributions being required. That means then that the fund is less reliant on strong asset returns to fund those benefits in the future, and there's less likelihood of having to ask other employers to foot the bill for employers who have ceased to participate and can no longer contribute to the fund. So it's a way of ensuring and sort of protecting other employers in the fund effectively. And I'll talk about how the different assumptions adopted for different types of employer play out and how that approach has changed since 2022 shortly. But before that, if we just talk about the other financial assumptions. So CPI, I mentioned earlier that that's our long-term best estimate of what Aon specialists think inflation is going to be in the future. At 2025, we believe that the figure is 2.1% per annum, which is a reduction against the assumption in 2022, which was 2.3% per annum. However, in 2022, we also included an additional uplift of 10% to the liabilities to reflect high short-term inflation. That was that spike that Euan showed on the chart earlier. Fast forward to the present day, we don't expect inflation to differ significantly to our assumption over the short term. So at 2025, there's no such uplift this time around. If we look at what's actually happened over the 3 years since the 22 valuation, as Euan mentioned earlier, pension increases have been 10.1, 6.7 and 1.7. So that's higher on aggregate than our assumption of 2.3, even allowing for the 10% inflation loading. So what we've seen at this valuation then is an increase in liabilities due to CPI inflation. However, because we're changing our assumptions from 2.3 down to 2.1 long term, that actually offsets that change, that experience. And therefore the liabilities are actually coming down overall as a result of the change in assumptions that we've made. I mentioned earlier that the pay increase assumption is linked to the CPI assumption. So we have kept the margin above CPI at 1.25 based on the experience analysis that we carried out. So again, that's coming down by 0.2 because CPI inflation's come down by 0.2. But it's also worth noting that increases over the 3 years since the last valuation were much higher than expected, around 6 to 7% per year. So again, that has increased liabilities on its own, but that change in assumptions that we're making has brought them back down again. So I mentioned earlier that we allow for different funding targets, different sets of assumptions for different employers based on their risk level. And that's shown on this chart. So what this shows then is the different funding targets that we adopt, and funding target, think of that as a set of assumptions. So those are listed down the left-hand side. It also shows the discount rate assumption for those funding targets at the 22 valuation. And then that being adopted at 2025 and the reason that we've made changes. So what you'll actually see then in the red text, we've shown how things have changed between 2022 and 2025, and actually the discount rates are pretty much unchanged from the 2022 valuation, other than for the orphan employers, and I'll come on to why that is in just a moment. But just quickly to summarise these different types of employers and what some of these phrases mean. So secure scheduled bodies are those with government backing, so that includes the councils, for example, but it also includes any employer which has a guarantee from such an employer to pay off their deficit if the employer is unable to, and that's what we call subsumption bodies. The intermediate employers are those who are open to new entrants and expected to be long term, but don't have that same government backing. So they're not as strong as the secure scheduled bodies. So what we do is we use a higher probability of funding success and therefore a lower discount rate to reflect this additional risk. Typically, we've categorized these within that group as well. So we had a low risk, medium risk and high risk intermediate funding target at the 22 valuation. That is still being considered at the 25 valuation. Initially, we've come up with a low and a medium risk funding target. The reason there's not a high risk is because there aren't any employers coming in that category anymore. And part of the reason this is still being considered is because that group of employers is now actually quite small. At the 22 valuation, it included the colleges in the fund, but because those bodies now have a government backing from the Department for Education, they're now included in that secure scheduled body funding target. We then have the orphan exit funding target. And so that's in respect of employers who have already exited the fund and had no backing from a secure scheduled body at that point. So these are valued using the lowest discount rate and the highest probability of funding success. And that's to avoid any deficit arising on those liabilities in the future, because any deficit arising would have to be paid for by all other employers in the fund, since those bodies no longer participate, we're not able to collect contributions from them. And then finally, we have the ongoing orphan employers. And these are employers that we know are going to become orphan exit in the future because they have a dwindling active membership and they have no backing from a secure scheduled body. But for now, they're still active in the fund in paying contributions. So in this case, we use two different discount rates. That's to reflect that they are currently contributing and still active, but over time, we expect them to be orphan exit. So we sort of trend towards that orphan exit position over their participation in the fund. So if we look at this table then and look through the changes that we've made and the assumptions we're adopting, you can see in that top line for the secure scheduled bodies, we had a probability of funding success of 76% and a discount rate of 4.5 at the 22 valuation. At the 25 valuation, we've increased the probability of funding success by 4% to 80%, but that actually results in the same discount rate of 4.5% at the 2025 valuation. The main reason that change has been made is to try and stabilise the primary contribution rate, which is something that LGPS regulations require us to do, but also to try and stabilise overall contributions where possible, which is one of the fund's objectives as well. Just for transparency, if the probability of funding success hadn't been increased, if it remained at 76%, the discount rate would be higher at 2025, and that's because our expectations for future returns on the fund's assets have increased compared to our expectations back in 2022. But as I explained, the main reason for making that change is to try and stabilise the primary contribution rate. There's a similar story then for the intermediate funding target, where with the bases that we've proposed at the moment, we are increasing the probability of fund success by 4%. For the orphan exit funding target, we already made quite a significant change in 2024 to review this funding target in light of market changes. So for the 2025 valuation, this has been kept at the same level as 2024, but that does represent a big increase in the discount rate and a reduction in liabilities compared to the 2022 valuation. So one key point to note then in what actually happened at the bottom is that the asset returns that the funds achieved over the last 3 years were actually below the average discount rate over the period from 2022 to 2025. So the fund has actually performed pretty well compared to some other LGPS funds, but on its own, this hasn't improved the funding position over the last 3 years. And as we'll come on to see later, what has led to the improvement in the funding position is largely the change in our assumptions. So with that background then, let's move on to section 2 and look at the initial results for the whole of the fund at the 2025 valuation. So this slide then shows the assets, the liabilities and the surplus in funding ratio at both the 22 valuation and the 25 valuation for the whole of West Yorkshire Pension Fund. So at a whole of fund level then, the position has improved by 4.4% from a funding ratio of 108.5% at 2022 to 112.9% in 2025. The liabilities are up by about 1.1 billion using those updated assumptions I talked about in the last section, but the assets are up by almost 2 billion. So what that means then is that the surplus has grown by just under 900 million from 1.4 billion at the 22 valuation to nearly 2.3 billion at the 25 valuation. Just going to pause there for 1 second just so that people can read that. Okay, so in terms of why those changes have happened then, this chart here shows the key reasons for the increase in the surplus. The bars to the left-hand side show the reasons why the position has worsened, and the bars to the right-hand side show why the position has improved. So as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, the main reason for the improvement is that we've changed the financial and demographic assumptions since the 22 valuation, which is the two big dark grey bars towards the bottom, and they've only been partially offset by the asset returns being slightly lower than expected, pay and pension increases being higher than expected, and then contributions being paid at a lower rate than the cost of benefits accruing because we were already letting employers pay lower than their primary rate at the last valuation. So those demographic changes, as I mentioned earlier, are based on our updated views and allowing for West Yorkshire Pension Fund's own experience. And the change in financial assumptions is largely from that reduction in our long-term CPI assumption compared with 3 years ago. As I noted earlier, the discount rate assumptions are largely unchanged despite those changes to the probability of fund success. So if I move on to the impact on contributions then. So the average primary rate, so the long-term cost of funding members' benefits, that's reduced from 17.9 in 2022 to 15.7 in 2025. Again, the main reason for that being the change in assumptions that we are adopting. And then the theoretical total contributions required on average by employers, so that allows for recovery of that £2.3 billion surplus I mentioned, is 10.7%. And for comparison, the average theoretical total rate at the 22 valuation was 16.5%, so that's a reduction of 5.8% on average. That change in total theoretical rate is also due to the change in assumptions that we're adopting, but you may also notice that the surplus recovered above and the recovery period bars on the chart here have changed compared to 2022, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail on the next slide where we sum this section up. The other point I just wanted to highlight is the point in red towards the bottom of the slide. So key takeaways from this really, this is a fund average, so this sort of allows for all employers being aggregated together. So the 10.7% wouldn't necessarily be the right number for every employer in the fund, but also that's a theoretical rate. That's not going to be the rate that most employers end up paying anyway, and that's because the fund has a policy of stepping or phasing contributions from current rates to the new rates. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail at the end of this next slide. So to finish off this section then, this slide I think nicely brings together the key elements of the funding strategy being used at the 2025 valuation, and it summarises some of those other changes that I haven't talked through in much detail yet. So just to recap then and make clear, on the left-hand side, as I've already mentioned, for the secure scheduled body funding target, we've increased the probability of fund success to 80% at this valuation. This isn't increasing the liabilities, as it actually leads to the same discount rate as used at the 2022 valuation. What it does do, though, is keep the contributions a bit more stable, in particular the primary contribution rate, which is something that is set out in regulations. We've then made a similar increase on the intermediate funding targets, although how these are used at this valuation is still under discussion, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll continue to work on that over the coming months with the fund. For the orphan exit funding target, the approach is unchanged from the updated approach agreed in 2024. And for the ongoing orphan employers, that then follows from that orphan exit approach and the change to the intermediate funding targets. The right-hand side then covers the bits I've not mentioned in much detail yet, so I'll talk through those in order now, starting with the recovery period in the top right. So the recovery period is the period over which the fund wants employers to make good any deficit, or over which the fund will permit an employer to recover any surplus. So that has been reduced from 22 years at the 22 valuation to a period of 20 years now. That's sort of like the typical for the fund. There will be different recovery periods for different employers, because for closed employers, we link it to the amount of time that they're expected to participate in the fund. So the reason that it was chosen to reduce the recovery period was because it was agreed in discussion with the advisory panel that 22 years was a bit of an arbitrary period. It was something that had built up over time, where we had 19 years at one valuation and it was pushed out to be 22 because it's a 3-year difference to align with the valuations. But we agreed it would be better if that period tied in with the period over which we carry out our actuarial modelling, which is 20 years. We did discuss whether the period could or should be reduced further, but it was noted that the Government Actuaries Department's Section 13 review, which Joel's going to talk about in a bit more detail later, that would likely flag the fund if the period was reduced too quickly. On balance, 20 years was determined to be an appropriate period. And the key thing to note for employers is that this will reduce the contributions required where the fund is in surplus, because what we're doing is we're recovering that surplus over a quicker period. So the secondary adjustment to the primary rate is going to be larger than it would have otherwise been. The next item then is the surplus buffer. At the 2022 valuation, we only permitted employers to recover any surplus above 105% funding. That limit was introduced following a period of adverse experience and general economic uncertainty between the valuation date and the date at which we had to certify the employer contributions payable. The fund did say that it would review this at the 2025 valuation, and having discussed this, it's been agreed that there isn't the same need at the 2025 valuation, and so employers' contributions will be calculated allowing for full recovery of the surplus over the recovery period at the 2025 valuation. Again, because we're allowing employers to recover more of the surplus, this reduces the contributions required by employers. And then the final item then in the bottom right is the stepping of employer contributions. So how do we move from the current rates to the new rates? And West Yorkshire Pension Fund has a history of stepping changes in contribution rates when rates are going up or coming down in order to smooth those changes. At the 22 valuation, this was typically done over 6 steps. However, the fund has agreed to reduce the stepping period to generally be 3 steps at the 25 valuation, but also to permit employers to generally pay the middle step across all 3 years to give a bigger immediate reduction, while still ensuring that the fund gets the same amount in contributions overall. So just to make that clear, as an example, if an employer was currently paying 17% and their new target rate was 11%, instead of stepping down in paying 15%, 13%, 11% over the next 3 years, the employer would pay 13% in all 3 years. So those points on the right-hand side have all led to reductions in contributions for employers. And in making those decisions, the fund has taken on board the comments from the employers in the FSS consultation process, as Euan mentioned earlier on. Right, I'm going to pass over to Joel now then to take you through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Right, so there's a few more sections left of our presentation today. I'll start off by looking at the employer outlook, just covering some of the different types of employer that Sam talked through earlier and what those various funding strategy step changes might mean for their rates. I'll then look at some post-valuation experience, just some comment on what's happened since the valuation date, and then finally we'll cover off with some hot topics that might be of interest to you as well. So initially, let's have a look at some of the outlook on contribution rates based on what we've discussed so far. So the councils, there's 5 sort of principal councils in the fund, and they comprise around 2/3 of the fund's assets. So when the officers and the advisory panel are considering the funding strategy for the fund, it's always with the outcome for these councils in mind. So these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. There's a sort of fiduciary duty to the councils to make sure that we're managing the rates of contributions that they're paying ultimately. So as you might expect, based on the whole of fund funding update that Sam showed you just now, the council's positions broadly moved in line with that. So the whole of fund funding ratio was in a good surplus of 112.9%, and the council, all of the councils will see around that sort of level of funding ratio. What that means for contribution rates, with the assumptions applied and being able to utilise some of that surplus and stepping the rates down, is that the councils are looking at contribution reductions in terms of percentage of pay of somewhere between 3.5% and 4% of pay. Now, that's quite a large reduction in contributions for the councils. I don't think we've seen that level of movement in evaluation, certainly not in my career, but certainly the fundamentals of the economic situation is suggesting that we can reduce contributions at this valuation. Clearly, in doing so, we have listened to feedback from the employers and the council. So as Sam says, we have taken out the 5% surplus buffer now, so they're able to get the benefit of all of the surplus. And we've decided not to be excessively prudent in the assumptions. When I say we, I of course mean the advisory panel. Some funds have gone further in terms of sort of prudence. They take much more of a stronger focus on stability of contributions, and they've sort of almost reduced the discount rate at this valuation to try and stabilise even further. But we felt that wasn't really in the right interest for the employers, given the level of surplus we're looking at. So overall, what does that mean for the 5 councils? It's around in the region of 50 to 60 million pounds a year in terms of savings, contributions into the pension scheme, and I think that's going to be well received. Just looking at the other employers, in fact, before I do so, I should note that there's quite a lot of contractors who pay the same contribution rate as the councils, and some of you may be listening in today. So if you're aware that you're in what's called a pass-through contract, where your risks are kind of managed by paying the council's rates, then your outcome is going to be the same as the council that you're providing your services to. In terms of other employers on the secure scheduled body funding target, there's around 100 or so ungrouped employers who we set an individual rate for. A lot of those are contractors, and their outcomes will be sort of move in a similar direction because you've got the same fundamentals impacting their rate. But of course, the sort of smaller the employer is, the more individual the outcome will be for them. So what's actually happened to their membership, the type of rate that they were set at the last valuation, were they recovering surplus then? There'll be all sorts of different funding levels going on within that group of employers. So whilst we can say that a lot of those employers are seeing reductions in contribution rates somewhere between 2% and 4%, there will be some sort of well outside of those ranges, and there will be some employers who actually do have a contribution rate increase coming through because of their circumstances. I should mention the academies. I just mentioned 100 or so ungrouped, but the academies are all grouped together by and large, bar a few of them who opted out of the academies pool. So we've got about 300 academy codes, I think, in the system, and there's there may be half multi-academy trusts of those, so they're sort of schools within the trusts. So we've got a lot of employers. They're around 7% of the fund overall. So they will all be set a sort of a very similar rate. I think they were all phased onto their sort of pool rate sort of currently, and the phasing will continue at this valuation, and we may end up with a single rate for all of them by the end of the 3-year recovery rates adjustment certificate. We also have another pool for town and parish councils, which has about 30 employers in it, where they are all sort of steering onto a sort of common contribution rate between them. And then, of course, we've got fire and police within this sort of category of employers as well. Sam mentioned the colleges. They had been on a different funding target and strategy before in the 2022 valuation, but they're now seen as secure scheduled bodies because we've got the DFE guarantee on them. Since the 22 valuation last year, we reviewed the college contribution rates because of that increase in the security for them, and so they did have a reduction to their contribution rates sort of earlier this year, but they'll probably get another sort of gradual contribution rate reduction coming through from this valuation as well. So their ultimate position is going to be sort of somewhere similar to the council's. So if we go on to sort of have a look at some other categories of employers on the next slide. So there's two other sort of funding targets that Sam mentioned just now. So if we look on the left there of the ongoing orphan employers, so as Sam mentioned, these are the employers who are essentially closed to new employers. They're much older, sort of community admission body type employers, and will eventually exit the fund. And when they do exit, there'll be no employer backing their liability should they fall into deficit. And so we've sort of traditionally taken a more prudent approach to their funding. We've only got about 7 of those employers left in the fund, so they have been dwindling down, and sort of in terms of total asset share, it's about 0.5%. So they're sort of quite insignificant in terms of the overall fund, but clearly from their own point of view, it's very important what their contribution rate comes out as. They are all in pretty good surplus. They've been well funded through paying high contribution rates for a long period of time now. And as Sam mentioned, the advisory panel did change the exit basis in terms of how we work out how much money they need to pay when these employers leave a few years ago now, and essentially sort of weaken that basis slightly. And the effect of that is that they are in a better position, these employers now. So some of them are sort of paying 0% of pay already, and others will see some quite large contribution rate reductions at this valuation. Just on the right there, the intermediate funding targets. These are the essentially long-term employers still who are still open to new entrants, but where the covenant of them isn't as strong as taxpayer-backed council. And traditionally, we've done covenant reviews of them to have a look into their capacity to support their pension obligations and contributions over the short, medium, long term, and that has affected sort of how prudent we are in the valuation. And as Sam mentioned, we're sort of moving that prudence sort of in a similar way to how we are the councils. But we've also lost a lot of employers from this group of employers as well. So as Sam mentioned, the colleges are now back in the scheduled body category. So we've got around 10 employers, I think, in this category now. So it's not too many, but there are some big ones in there. We have all the universities. I think there's 5 unis in the fund, some of which are quite big. The housing associations sitting on quite a bit of liability. And then we've got a couple of other employer education type employers in there too. So the results for them are sort of, we haven't had the line drawn under them yet. We are going to be doing some covenant reviews, and that may impact where they end up. The trajectory is sort of a slight contribution rate reduction by the looks of it. But what we do have to bear in mind is that sort of collectively as this group of employers, they're still sitting on around an exit debt of around 260 million, which is not an unsubstantial amount of money. And so we just need to be cautious if we're reducing contribution rates for these employers, not to be doing that too far and too fast, if sort of fundamentally the covenant review is suggesting something that we should be doing something different. So that's a work in progress, sort of where we're going to land with those employers at the moment. So if we just move on, so that was just a quick whistle stop through sort of what we might be looking at for the employer rates. In terms of where this process is going to go over the next few months, we've obviously got this an employer meeting now where we're sort of introducing the whole of fund results and giving an indication of where we might be seeing the rates. Sam and I and the team here at Aon still need to go through and process all of the contribution results. So we've had an early sight of what they're all looking like, but we just need to make sure we've dotted the I's and crossed the T's on them. And there might be some discussions, of course, with the officers where anything bespoke needs to be done. So around Christmas and the turn of the year, we're hoping to have got most of the employer rates out to the employers in draft. And then there'll be sort of final bits and pieces, discussions with employers as we're moving towards the ultimate deadline of 31 March next year, where that's the hard sort of sign off of the valuation report. The rates take effect from the 1st of April. And so we need to have polished the whole thing off by then. And as Euan mentioned, you've got the final advisory panel meeting sort of mid-March, where that there will be a line drawn under everything in terms of the strategy. Okay, so in the final section of today, there's actually two parts to this. So let's move to the first part first, which is just looking at what's happened since the valuation date. So, when we're talking about the valuation results, we are looking at the position at a point in time at 31 March this year. And even though we're taking a long time view, things do happen throughout the valuation year. And we do keep an eye on it, because if things start moving in completely the wrong direction, then, and this was the case in 2022, in fact, we don't want to be, say, reducing contributions fast if say if the investments were something different was happening in the investment markets, and we could see a deficit sort of coming down the track. So we do keep our eye on this, and in 2022, this is why we had the 5% surplus buffer, which, as Sam explained, we've based on what we're seeing in terms of markets and the way things have moved since the valuation date, we don't feel that we need that protection in this valuation when looking at rates. So what has happened? So in terms of the liabilities, we haven't seen a big movement in where we would be setting our financial assumptions, the discount rate, CPI assumption. If we were just redoing the valuation at 30th of June, 30th of September, etc., we look at these things on a quarterly basis. So there's been no major movement there. Sort of, if anything, inflation expectations are maybe up a little bit, and that would be sort of detrimental to the funding position, but nothing that's sort of like shifting the dial too much. As Euan and I think Sam mentioned, inflation has been a touch high, and we're going to get probably a high pension increase of high-ish pension increase of 3.8% coming through next year. When we set our 2.1%, we do have a short-term sort of uplift within that. So we were expecting, a slightly higher rate of inflation over year one, but not quite as high as 3.8. So there is a little bit of an inflation headwind that's sort of arisen. On the other side, the assets haven't done too badly. We're still sort of in positive territory. So, at this stage in 2022, I think the assets had lost about 5% of their value. So the assets are currently up. But of course, what we've got to be doing on a day-by-day basis is beating our discount rate in order to stand still. So, we're projecting 4.5% within the discount rate every year. So your investments have to do 4.5% in order to not create some additional deficit. So at the moment, we're beating that. The fund is beating that, so that's not too bad at all. And so, bringing it all together, we don't see any reason for sort of panicking at this stage and sort of saying, we can't. We're more than happy to follow through with these contribution rate reductions that we're forecasting. So just as I say, this is the final part of the session, is a bit on the hot topics. So just sort of this one is related to the valuation, and then I've got a couple of consultations that have happened since our last annual meeting, which I'll just run through very quickly. But when we're doing the valuation, we do have some central oversight that we need to keep an eye on, and that's, as you would have heard us say at these sessions in the past, it's the Section 13 of the Public Service Pensions Act, and this is MHCLG's power to commission an external actuary to have a look at what all the funds are doing in their triennial valuations, and just making sure that no one's doing anything that the department wouldn't be happy with. So that, they've devolved all this stuff down to the locals. They want to make sure that we don't have funds which are just not paying any money in, or indeed paying too much money in, which is in MHCLG's interest as well. So what the regulations say is that the Government Actuaries Department is the independent actuary that they appoint, but they're looking at 4 things. So are we and the fund being compliant with what the regulations say we have to do in evaluation? Basically do it in a year, and set some rates for the next 3 years. Are we being, we don't have to be consistent, but the regulations say so long as we're not being inconsistent with what other funds are doing. That is a bit of a grey area, and it's something that funds and the actuaries that advise the funds are not particularly happy with, because we don't want any sort of central steer as to government setting what the contribution rates are, etc. Otherwise we end up in a teachers, police or fire type of contribution rates of high 20%. Everyone's doing the same thing. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're obviously trying to make the best decisions locally and for the fund and based on what the fund's investing in. The other thing they're looking at is to make sure that when we're setting the contributions, we're trying to ensure solvency and long-term cost efficiency. So, what do these things mean? So for solvency, it doesn't mean you've got to have enough money in the fund at all times, but it means that the whole funding strategy itself has to be a plan to get to 100% over the long term, and the employers in the fund have to have the sort of financial capacity to be able to make a change to their contributions should something happen that requires it. So sort of just taking a long-term view to make sure that we're just sort of keeping a steady ship there. In terms of long-term cost efficiency, that's more focused on intergenerational fairness, I'd say. So certainly when these regulations were brought out, there was a worry that funds just weren't paying enough into them. There was too much pressure from the councils to keep contribution rates low, and government wanted to make sure that that wasn't at the detriment of future taxpayers, and local government wasn't getting itself into trouble. Of course, what we're seeing at the moment, and this is something that we're expecting the Government Actuaries Department to be looking closely at this valuation, is to make sure we're not just keeping hold of that surplus and not reducing contributions fast enough, because that's at the detriment of current taxpayers and services. So,
Joel.
Oh yeah.
I think we're going to need to move on.
Okay.
In the interest of time. You've got a couple more slides. I don't know whether you would quickly flick them up on the screen to do with consultations, haven't you?
Yeah, of course, Euan. Yeah, no worries.
But yeah, whether you just touch on this one quickly, but we need to move over to John in a minute or two, I think. Yeah,
of course. So yeah, in terms of this is just a chart of sort of where the funding levels of each fund in the UK were at the last Section 13 review, just relative to each other. So you can see for the West Yorkshire Fund, you were paying one of the lower contribution rates in the country. You were there or thereabouts in the middle in terms of your funding ratio. What I expect to be the case at this valuation is that you'll still be towards the bottom of the total contribution rates payable, but there probably will be a lot of funds moving around in this matrix because we've seen a lot of different investment return experience. So West Yorkshire's return has been very good, I'd say, on average, but we've seen some funds across the country have had some quite bad returns relative to your own. So yeah, that was just pointing this out. Okay. So if we move on, I think
I wonder whether we will circulate the slides, won't we, at the end of the meeting? So perhaps we wrap up there and
should we wrap
pass
that up?
Pass over to John if that's okay.
Yeah, a couple of interesting consultations, so please read those at your leisure and let us know if you've got any questions on them. Thanks, Euan.
Thank you very much. I think I've got one or two quick slides just segueing into John. So similar theme from last year, government's very keen on scale in pensions, not just in the LGPS, but generally. There's something called a pension scheme bill, which is currently passing through the House of the Parliament. And we're expecting a budget on the 26th of November. There could be pensions tax changes in there. If there is, they're unlikely to be good news. But we'll wait and see and obviously communicate with employers as soon as we hear anything. On that point, I think I'm going to pass over to John, our Chief Investment Officer.
Thank you very much. As Euan said, I'm John Dewey, Chief Investment Officer of West Yorkshire Pension Fund. Joined the fund in April, so a little more than 6 months now within the fund. So in this short presentation, I'd like to take you through a whistle-stop tour of the portfolio, so the investments of the fund and some of the key themes that we're seeing and navigating in markets today. And this quite busy table is showing what we call the strategic asset allocation. So the allocation of assets that's been set out within our investment strategy statement agreed by the fund's advisory panel. And it sets us a reference point for the types of assets held and the amount of investment risk that we should take within the fund. And next to these benchmark allocations, we've shown our current allocation. So this is an audited figure at the end of October, so quite live, only 10 days old. And I'd just like to highlight a few key points from this. In public equities, so listed equity market holdings, with slightly over the benchmark of 60%, so about 61%. We've reduced this down to bring down that allocation a little bit in October, reflecting our outlook for equity markets. But what we've retained here is an overweight position, so slightly more allocation to the UK and slightly less to North America. And I'll maybe come on to the rationale for that allocation, but that's a very deliberate allocation, both to equities overall and to particularly weight the UK and reduce North America. Part of it is the outlook for the asset classes. Part of it is thinking about currencies and the risk from currency movements, given the fund's payments are all in sterling. In private markets, so in private equity and infrastructure, we're slightly overweight, quite close in private equity to our target benchmark allocation, overweight in infrastructure. We like the long-term, secure cash flow properties of high-quality infrastructure assets. So we're very comfortable with that 6.1% allocation. In government bonds, we are in the midst of a piece of activity at the moment, so I won't cover it in a lot of detail, but as equity markets have increased faster than bond markets, we found ourselves a little bit underweight, and we've also sold out of global sovereigns, so bonds issued by governments other than the UK government, and we've reduced that down, and we're looking to increase our allocation to the UK on the basis of higher yields, again reducing currency risk, and because we think the yield levels there are very attractive, and more on that shortly. In corporate bonds, so lending to companies both in public markets and private markets, we have a relatively small allocation compared to the benchmark of 5.5%. And again, we're in the midst of a piece of activity there to increase the credit quality of the companies we're lending to, so reduce the lending to the lower quality companies, increase the lending to higher quality companies, and to reduce the exposure overall, because we don't think the reward we're getting there is as attractive as it has been. We've done very well holding corporate bonds, so lending to companies, and we're now taking the opportunity to reduce that down. Alternatives and property are below our current benchmark allocation, but we're looking to increase them. And what you'll see on the last line here is that the fund currently, as at the end of October, does hold a significant allocation to cash. Part of that is a deliberate decision given the yields available on cash and the relatively low risk profile of those cash and money market instruments. Some of that is going to be reallocated quite quickly to property, to private markets, and to government bonds, as I alluded to. So that's the broad snapshot of the picture as at the end of October. Moving on to some of the holdings that we have within our US equity portfolio. Some of the largest, most well-known names are these large technology companies you hear so much about and whose services we're familiar with. Largest of those holdings is Nvidia, the semiconductor manufacturer that's experienced a huge growth over this artificial intelligence boom we've seen. So it's experienced roughly 150% returns since the end of 2022, and artificial intelligence and technology are things we'll talk more about. But these large technology names have really been driving the growth in global equity markets. The fund holds roughly 276 million pounds in sterling equivalent of Nvidia, about 226 million pounds of Apple, and 216 million pounds of Alphabet, the parent company of Google. So it just gives you a flavour of the type of significant allocations that the fund makes to these large technology names. But we're also active investors in the UK in both public and private markets. Some of the largest holdings are in well-known companies like Unilever, like AstraZeneca, the large banks that form a large part of the UK index, but also well-known names like Tesco's, where we have approximately 50 million pounds exposure. Diageo, known for its Guinness. Fun fact is that our pro rata allocation corresponds to about 2.7 million pints of Guinness per year produced, which is an interesting mental image to bear in mind. But importantly, also significant jobs underpinned by our investments in both public markets, private markets in the UK, and also in assets like property, where closer to home, we've made allocations, in this case, an equity allocation to the redevelopment in the Leeds South Bank regeneration area, so Water Lane in Leeds, for 375 new homes currently under construction. Similarly, a debt allocation in the Kirkstall Road area of Leeds to regenerate residential housing there, and also things like investments in Northern Gritstone, which is a company that works closely with the universities of Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester and Sheffield to invest in high-tech, fast-growing companies in life sciences, in health tech and medical technology, so we can stimulate that kind of exciting growth in innovative companies at the same time as generating returns for the fund. We also invest in infrastructure. The M6 toll road, familiar to some of you. So the GLIL partnership, in collaboration with a number of other pension funds, owns 25% of the M6 toll road. The total allocation of the fund is about 650 million pounds, so a very significant allocation to a whole range of mainly UK infrastructure type assets. And these are really attractive because they're typically backed by physical assets that are doing real work in the economy. They provide typically reliable cash flows, often with inflation linkage, and they offer diversification from other financial assets. And one quite interesting one that's recently been deployed within that infrastructure partnership is in the Haweswater Aqueduct project. This is a project that delivers drinking water to 2.5 million residents in Cumbria, Lancashire, Greater Manchester, feeding from beautiful Haweswater in the Lake District. And it's a series of tunnels and aqueducts designed to deliver that in an efficient way. So that's been a recent investment in August as part of that infrastructure programme. I mentioned we've been increasing our allocation to government bond yields, and the reason for this is that the yields or the prospective returns available are significantly higher than they have been in recent history. So here you can see the return you would get from investing in a 30-year UK government bond, so lending money to the UK government for 30 years. And as anyone who's had a mortgage over this period knows, those rates got very, very low before the COVID crisis and then went up extremely sharply. Inflation peaked at more than 11% in the UK, and interest rates, or the reward that government bond investors demanded, went up very significantly and has continued to creep up. So as that has risen, we have taken advantage of good opportunities to buy those bonds and to lock in those high level of yields with the backing of the UK government. And that's also been done in inflation-linked payments, given the inflation-linked nature of a lot of the fund's liabilities. On the other hand, the additional reward or the credit spread from lending to companies varies over time, depending on the economic environment. During periods of risk, you typically get a high reward. But as you can see, this chart is about at the lowest level that we've seen in recent history. So here in particular, this is the additional reward you expect to be paid from investing in high quality US companies. And it's relatively low. And for that reason, we think it's perhaps not sufficient to have as high an allocation as we've had in the past. The fact that this is a low level means that our holdings in corporate bonds have performed extremely well, and we're taking some of that profit and investing it elsewhere. Which touch on some of the broader themes that we're experiencing. This is a measure of uncertainty around trade and tariffs. And in the time I've got left, there's not enough time to do this justice, but the punchline is really that until about this time last year, companies had a pretty clear understanding of the terms and the mechanisms for trading internationally, whether it was importing German cars to Asia or consumer goods from China to the US. And that's all changed for the reasons I think that we all know as we watch the news. So although the markets seem fairly sanguine about this today, this has created a huge amount of uncertainty about what impact this will have on inflation, on the cost of living, and on corporate profitability, all things that the investment team is watching extremely closely when it's making its investment decisions. And finally, last but not least, perhaps the biggest and most important theme in markets today is technology and artificial intelligence. I could talk for an hour and a half on this topic alone, but just a few thoughts to leave you with. One is that in the United States, where a lot of these companies are based, the growth and the increase in value of these companies is such that even the main index, the S&P 500 of 500 companies, has become a lot more concentrated. So those Magnificent Seven, so those top 7 technology companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Google, Tesla, Nvidia, and Facebook, are now approximately 30% of that index. And I particularly like this quote, which is quite dated now, but this is from a Nobel laureate, Robert Solow, way back in the 80s. And it feels like this is particularly true today. Artificial intelligence, everyone's talking about it, but it's not showing up in productivity or profitability yet. And the numbers are mind-boggling. So just these 5 companies here are investing today almost 6% of US gross domestic product per annum in the growth of artificial intelligence. So to put some numbers to this, that's about $1.75 trillion a year just from these 5 companies to invest in the growth. And there are many questions about what this will, how this will turn out. Will it result in the same kind of profits to match and outstrip that investment? And will these be the companies who make those profits, or will it be other companies? So a significant proportion of our time within the investment team is understanding the trends in technology and AI, balancing how the fund's assets are invested, where it makes sense to align ourselves with some of these trends, and where it makes sense to be extremely cautious and not expose the fund to excessive risk. So as I say, this this probably doesn't do justice to the topic, but in the interest of time, I think I'll stop there, and it's probably not a bad place to stop, given how important this theme is in investment markets today.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm conscious of the time. It's 3 o'clock, and that's what we sort of budgeted for. I've got one more slide before wrapping up, which is just around pooling. You'll see a lot about this in the press. The important bit is the point at the bottom. I don't think it should be a big deal for West Yorkshire employers or members. I think it should be broadly neutral. It's a big deal for the fund because there's a lot of change going on. All the investment team, John and his team, will effectively need to transfer to a new company. But I don't think it will seriously change the investment returns or the risks that we're running. Positive on balance, but there's a lot of work to do. So final thoughts there. I don't know if there is any final questions people have. I'm conscious of time, but we can do our best to answer them if people don't mind staying on for a minute or two longer. But thank you all for listening. Please raise your hand if you have got anything, and we'll fend the best we can. Okay. Well, thank you all for attending. Please do get in touch with your normal employer representatives or one of us if you do have any questions, but wish you all good afternoon. Thank you.